Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. I'm really excited about this particular video I get to make because I'm going to be talking about a book I just finished listening to with my girls for the first time for them. I've read it many, many times, but it's The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. I have here a little pocket edition that I got for a present a number of years ago. As I said, the version we just did was an audiobook version that was read by Andy Serkis, who is, of course, the voice actor who did Gollum in Peter Jackson's trilogy of The Lord of the Rings, and I think he was also in the newer Hobbit trilogy, which we won't talk about. That movie is not my favorite, but the Lord of the Rings film version of Peter Jackson is what I watched as I was growing up. I had read the books already once, but watching those films really just drew me into the world and made me a huge fan of Tolkien. And I love those films, although they have their own critics, of course. Not as big of a fan of the newer films, but you can never go wrong with the book. And the book is a phenomenal, phenomenal read. And The Hobbit, of course, is what was first published back in the 30s, and that kind of put Middle Earth, hobbits, and the ring on people's minds and imagination, and set the stage for Tolkien's publication of his longer trilogy, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, a few decades later. And of course, we've been spoiled and blessed in the years since with many of Tolkien's writings, some of which were published during his time, many of which were not published during his life, as his son Christopher has gone through and put together many of his writings, both about Middle Earth and other things as well. So there's a whole broad world of Tolkien studies and literature that is out there today, but it all started with The Hobbit. And in many ways, The Hobbit stands as kind of a unique writing in Tolkien's lore of Middle Earth because it was written as a children's book and very much stands strong as a children's book. And it is working with the same world, some of the same characters, and some of the same themes of Tolkien's larger works like the Silmarillion or the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And yet it retains a kind of children's point of view that is unique amongst Tolkien's writings, and that makes it a really, really wonderful thing to read and to listen to. And it was a delight to be able to read this familiar classic with my girls. We had a long drive out west to visit family, and were able to listen to Andy Serkis reading The Hobbit, and they were captivated. My 7-year-old absolutely loved it. My 5-year-old really enjoyed it. My 3-year-old, or not yet 3-year-old, was tired of it pretty soon, but she's not yet 3. We'll give her a pass for now. But my kids really enjoyed it. They've been playing The Hobbit ever since. They found a rock in the yard, which they've dubbed the Arkenstone, and they carry it around and do different things. And they're downstairs right now coloring a Hobbit door and dagger and all of those types of things. So I think that itself is perhaps the best review, that here about 100 years after Tolkien first published this book, you can read it to your kids and their minds and imaginations will be completely gripped by it. So what I'm going to do today is just give a brief review and reflection of this book. Spoilers, I will be assuming that you have read this book or don't mind hearing spoilers, so if you don't want any spoilers, turn off this video, go get a copy of the book and read it. That would be probably better use of your time no matter what. But anyways, if you want to keep watching, here are some of my thoughts on this wonderful classic by J.R.R. Tolkien, The Hobbit. So as I said, this is been out for about 100 years now, and is a wonderful story of a mild-mannered hobbit, very kind of small, reclusive creatures that don't like to go on adventures, don't like to be involved in the big goings-ons of the world, who gets his comfortable life messed up by Gandalf the Wizard, who gets Bilbo Baggins, the Hobbit in question, embroiled in this grand adventure with a bunch of dwarves to go travel across the wilderness to the Lonely Mountains to try and steal back treasure that had been taken from them by the dragon Smaug. And so you see this kind of grand quest and adventure tale. And Tolkien does just a wonderful job of character development, of taking Bilbo Baggins, who, again, we meet him originally smoking on his front doorstep, very content, very happy with the world. He's well-to-do. He doesn't need to go anywhere and find any adventures, and he gets drawn into this great story. And we see him really growing and developing throughout, to where at the end, he's really almost one of the linchpin figures, and other characters like the dwarves, who were originally kind of viewing him with a kind of sneering and dismissive eye, are looking to him as a leader, and we see him grow into that role. So it's really wonderful to see the way that he develops as a character, and I think something that kids can relate to. They see someone who feels a lot like them, right? Small and overlooked, neglected and kind of dismissed, who becomes this grand adventurer and hero kind of in his own right. So I think there's a reason why The Hobbit has grabbed the imagination of children for nearly a century now. You see Tolkien really enjoying himself with this book. There are nods and allusions to the bigger, grander mythology that he will develop over the years, and that he had already been developing behind the scenes as he was writing and publishing this. But he told this originally as a story to his kids, and that's really what it sort of stands as on its own. It can be very whimsical at times. You see Tolkien loving to play with language and ideas. He was first and foremost a linguist and a lover of literature, and that comes out in this book. There's a wonderful example of this at the beginning of the book, where Bilbo Baggins is sitting out front of his hobbit hole smoking his pipe, and Gandalf the wizard comes up, and Bilbo says, "Good morning," and he meant it. The sun was shining, the grass was very green, but Gandalf looked at him from under long bushy eyebrows that stuck out further than the brim of his shady hat. "What do you mean?" he said. "Do you wish me a good morning? Or mean that it is a good morning whether I want it or not? Or that you feel good this morning? Or that it is a morning to be good on?" "All of them at once," said Bilbo, "and a very fine morning for a pipe of tobacco out of doors into the bargain." You just see Tolkien there kind of playing with what do we mean when we say good morning? There's another good example of that later in the book. I won't read it, where Bilbo is captured by the trolls and trying to convince them not to eat him, and he's trying to say, "I can cook you a meal," and he says, I cook better than I cook, if you know what I mean." And there's a couple of different examples of that where Tolkien will kind of just play with language. So you see a kind of playfulness in him in The Hobbit that you don't always get in the Silmarillion, for example. But the story is really wonderful. It's full of adventure. It's full of memorable characters. It's full of, again, as I said, Bilbo as a very relatable hero and protagonist for, I think, all of us, and especially for kids. But a couple of themes that stood out to me just listening to this again was the theme of what's interesting is when you read the book, again, giving spoilers here, I'm assuming that you've read it or you don't care, you'll find that the plan that Gandalf and the dwarves and others kind of put in place is not what ends up happening. They get kind of thrown off course, here, there, and everywhere, and yet Tolkien will kind of zoom out and sort of editorialize or narrate and say, but that was really lucky, because what they didn't know was if they had followed their plan, they would have run into these problems, and the fact that their plan was overturned and they had to go this way meant that it was exactly where they needed to go. And so there's kind of this interplay of luck or fortune with fate or providence, I would sort of say, from a more Christian perspective. And you see this kind of coming out more explicitly at the end, where Bilbo's made it back to the Shire, he's made it back to his hobbit hole, and Gandalf is visiting him. And Bilbo is just kind of wondering and marveling at the fact that through all their adventures, the old prophecies and things have turned true. So Bilbo says, "Then the prophecies of the old songs have turned out to be true, after a fashion," said Bilbo. "Of course," said Gandalf. "And why should not they prove true? Surely you don't disbelieve the prophecies because you had a hand in bringing them about yourself. You don't really suppose, do you, that all your adventures and escapes were managed by mere luck, just for your sole benefit? You're a very fine person, Mr. Baggins, and I'm very fond of you, but you're only quite a little fellow in a wide world, after all." "Thank goodness," said Bilbo, laughing, and handed him the tobacco jar. And I love that, because you see Tolkien's kind of nod to the fact that the story of Bilbo is part of a bigger story, and that there's something behind all of the events and adventures that have taken place, guiding it and bringing it to a certain conclusion. You very much get this with Tolkien, where he doesn't write as a Christian in the same way that Lewis does, for example, in the Chronicles of Narnia, where Lewis is drawing out very clear analogies and connections between his characters and Christ and redemption and atonement and all these types of things. Tolkien doesn't like to do that. He plays more subtly And yet you see here at the end of The Hobbit a kind of nod to his Christian framework, where he is recognizing that the stories that we are part of, the stories of our lives, the things that seem to be by luck or by chance, are not actually so. They're actually falling under the sovereign control of God, of providence. And there's a nod to that here, I think, with Bilbo. And of course, if you have read The Hobbit and you have read The Lord of the Rings, you'll know that even trivial things like the ring that Bilbo finds in this book becomes absolutely central to the books that follow, and really to the stories of the ending of the Third Age, and all these grand cosmic things are hinging on what seem like small, inconsequential moments of luck or chance. And Tolkien, I think, is making a broader point there about our own lives and things in the history of our own stories, in the history of the world, that God is the one who is bringing them to their right end. God is the one who is weaving together a much bigger tapestry from the little threads that make up our lives. And so Tolkien's little book, The Hobbit, kind of plays with that theme in some really, really wonderful ways. And of course, one of the other themes that comes out, this is a treasure hunt story. It's a quest to find the dragon's treasure. And yet one of the things that comes out and that really makes Bilbo stand out is that he is not gripped and governed by the love of gold and treasure in the way that others are. And so we get this very touchingly portrayed when Thorin, the leader of the dwarves, is dying at the end of the book, and he was gripped by the love of the treasure of the Arkenstone, so much so that he was willing to go to war with everyone around him and even throw off Bilbo, who had been his close friend, had saved his life numerous times, that he had pledged his loyalty and service to, and yet the dragon's gold gripped his heart and turned him against all of these things. And it's Bilbo who kept his head in all of that. And so as Thorin later lies dying, he's reconciled to Bilbo, and these are his kind of final words to his friend. He says, there's more in you of good than you know, child of the kindly West. He's speaking here to Bilbo Baggins. Some courage and some wisdom blended in measure. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. But sad or merry, I must leave it now. Farewell. Just this wonderful scene where Bilbo is acknowledged as kind of being the hero, even though he had been the overlooked and the quiet one. Tolkien is always playing with that theme, that it's the small things, the overlooked things, the quiet things, the neglected things that can prove to be most important and most consequential, because they're part of something bigger. And the big things, right, God himself delights to use the small things to accomplish his purposes. And I think that's part of what Tolkien is wanting all of us to recognize, and children to see, that just because they're small doesn't mean they're unimportant. And The Hobbit drives that home in a really wonderful way. This is just a fun book. It's a great book. It's worth a read, whether you are 5 years old, whether you're 95 years old. Always worth listening to. And I would, just as a kind of aside here, Andy Serkis's rendition of this, his voice acting of this, is phenomenal. Not only does he do a great job with Gollum's voice, which we would expect, but with all the characters, he does a great job of portraying them, and he does his best to sing the songs that Tolkien wrote. This is a book that's full of songs. And so I would highly recommend, if you are going to get an audiobook version, the Andy Serkis version is a great one to get. But whether you're getting it in audio or in print, I would highly recommend The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien.